The final method you will learn to solve quadratic equations is using the quadratic formula. This method, you should know, works every single time. There will be times where you might try to factor an equation, whether it's by using the GCF or factoring a trinomial, for example, and you will not be able to factor it. So this method works every time. Even with graphing, unless you have a graphing calculator, you might run into problems when you get values that are not whole numbers. So let's take a look at first what the quadratic formula is. It is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So here, you want to repeat this several times over and over till you get to the point where you've memorized it. You want to internalize it. Just know it by heart. Let's go ahead and start using it with example 1. The very first thing you want to do is identify your a, b, and c values. That's for x squared, our coefficient is 5. For x, the coefficient is 3. And our constant is a negative 10 because of that minus sign. Now let's go ahead and start plugging these values in. So we have x is equal to negative b, and I always recommend you plug in numbers in parentheses to avoid making mistakes. So that's negative 3. We next have the plus or minus the square root of b squared, which again plug in that 3 with parentheses, and that's squared minus 4 ac. A is 5 and c is negative 10. Extend your radical to cover that whole thing, and it's all divided by 2 times a, which here is a 5. Now we just need to go ahead and start following the order of operations until we get to our two solutions. So this is a negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared is 9. When you multiply these numbers out, negative 4 times 5 times negative 10, you get positive 200. That's all divided by 2 times 5, 10. X is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 200 is 209. That's all divided by 200. When you go ahead and type in your calculator the square root of 209 and round to the nearest hundredth, you should get 14.46. And now we're going to get two solutions. To get our first solution, we take negative 3 plus 14.46 and divide that by 10. So the first solution you get is x is equal to positive 1.15. And the second solution, you do negative 3 minus 14.46, all divided by 10. That should give you negative 1.75. So the two solutions are 1.15 and negative 1.75. In example 2, we're going to, again, first identify a, b, and c. A is the coefficient of the square term, or t squared in this case, negative 16. B is equal to, wait, there is no t term. So because it's not there, that means the coefficient is 0. And our constant c is 80. If you recall this equation, this is the equation from the problem where the bird drops a stick from its mouth till it hits the ground, from outcome 26. Okay, let's go ahead and plug in our values. We have negative b, which is a 0 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 0, and that's squared, minus 4. We have ac. A is negative 16. C is 18 or 80. And that's all divided by 2a. 2 is negative 16. So again, once you've plugged your values in, let's just go ahead and start simplifying. Negative 0, there's no such thing as a negative 0. It's just 0. But why even write it? Because when we add it or subtract it, it's not going to make a difference. So I'll just leave it out. We have plus or minus, positive or negative, the square root of 0 squared. In this case, we can write that 0. Again, probably not necessary, but when you multiply these three values out, the two negatives do make this a positive, and that becomes positive 5,120. That's all divided by 2 times negative 16 is negative 32. Let's continue to simplify. That's plus or minus the square root of, this becomes just 5,120. And that's all over negative 32. So we take the square root of 5,120, and you should get 71.55 once you round that to the nearest hundredth. And that's all divided by negative 32. So again, let's go ahead and get our two solutions. First, we have positive 71.55 divided by negative 32. When you take that into your calculator, you should get a negative 2.24. And secondly, we have negative 71.55 divided by negative 32, and that should give you a positive 2.24. Now let's take a look at our third example, which is example 3, not a 1. Now, let's go ahead and again identify our a, b, and c values. So a, the coefficient of x squared, is 2. B, the coefficient of x, is 1. And c, our constant, is 4. Now let's go ahead and start plugging each one of these values into our formula, into the quadratic formula. So we have negative b, which is not a b, is a 1. So negative 1, that's a negative 1 there. And that's plus or minus the square root of what is b, 1. And that gets squared minus 4ac. A is 2, c is 4. Again, extend that radical all the way. All divided by 2a, where a is a 2. Okay, so now let's go ahead and begin simplifying. That's a negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared is 1. And negative 4 times 2, 8 times 4, that's a negative 32. And that's all divided by 2 times 2, which is 4. So we continue to simplify under our radical. Negative 1 plus or minus 1 minus 32. That's negative 31. And that's all divided by 4. All right, hit the stop button here. So you have to recall from a previous lesson that once you get a negative value underneath the radical, you will not find two of the same number, that multiply with each other to give you that negative value. So for your purpose in Algebra 1, this means no solution. And as I mentioned before, in Algebra 2, you'll learn how to write this solution using imaginary numbers. But for your purpose, a negative number under the radical allows you to conclude there is no solution.